Hi everyone, and welcome to Best of Both Worlds. Stay tuned because Paige Johnson is back. Thanks for joining us today. We have a special guest again, and it's Paige Johnson. Thank you for coming back, Paige.
Oh, well, thank you for having me.
I loved what you did last time,
it.
and I can't wait to see everything that we're going to do today.
Okay.
This is
a semi-custom. And it's something that I've developed for my customer base. I quilt full-time for customers. And full-blown custom, where you put a design in each segment, takes a long time.
And stitching in the ditch, yes.
Yes, it takes a long time. So I want to offer my customers something that looks custom, but it doesn't take me as much time. And this is a perfect example of a semi-custom.
I can't wait to see it.
Good.
All right, let's get started.
This type of quilt is a perfect quilt for a semi-custom design. It is blocks that are repeating over and over the same block. I can use one design on that block and it's going to show up in an area, such as the white here. Now this layout is using the same block, but it's set up in a tessellating layout. The block next to it is a mirror image. So we're going to be needing two patterns of the same design to make this quilt work. First, I need to make some patterns to go with my quilt, and we had looked at how those blocks were set up tessellating. So I'm going to place one of my blocks. I'm going to look down here and I can see that my pattern height is 10 inches. The blocks on this quilt are actually 9.5. My freeze aspect is on, so if I change my pattern height, once I hit enter, the width will change accordingly. I'm going to place one of those blocks on the screen using repeat patterns. I do have a Diago feather already. This is a pattern from TJ Spicer. I'm going to flip this pattern horizontally, and I'm going to reverse the starts and end. I always want a pattern that starts on the left and ends on the right. So now I have a reverse of this pattern. I can export that pattern and it will come into my project. Let's make sure I put it in the right spot. And I always label these as reverse so that I can make sure I'm using the right one. Okay, now for the magic. On this quilt, I'm going to be quilting all the way off the edge. I'm not doing a separate border. That's what makes it semi-custom. So I want to set up my patterns to fit this quilt. This is going to be a semi-custom, and I'm going to take the designs right over the border. They won't be separate. I want to set up my pattern before I start to quilt. And I'm going to need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 blocks. I'm also going to need one for each border because that pattern is going to continue over the border. So I'm going to need 8 blocks across, my 6 plus 1 for each border, and I'm going to need 10 blocks down, my 8 blocks and 1 for each border. So I have my 2 patterns. I'm going to concatenate these once again. The pattern that is blue is selected. To select another pattern, I hold down the Control key while I click on it. I've now set my concatenating order. I can go into repeat patterns, and I want 8 repeats by 6 blocks and 2 borders and 10 rows. I'm going to place that on the screen. Here is our pattern layout, and I want to make sure I'm looking at the second row, second pattern in, and that's going to be the first one that shows in the white block, and that is falling in the right direction. The thing is, I want these patterns to fit in the row after that as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my top row and I'm going to flip it vertically. I'm going to select every other row and flip them vertically. So I'm getting a different look to my patterns. That is going to be the layout that I'm going to want for this quilt. Putting the layout is what I do first, then I'll set it onto the quilt. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show Statler where this quilt is. I'm going to put in 2 sets of boundaries. One is going to be on the outside of my quilt, showing where the outside of the quilt is. The second boundary is going to show me where my second row of blocks is. So I'm going to make a new boundary, and I'm going to click right on those seam intersections where the end of my block is. And I'm going to do this over and hitting the corners, but not every 4 corner. I'm only hitting 3 corners. I want that corner to show, so I'm going to click up and off to the side and end up here before I hit stop. As you can see on my screen, I've got some fairly unusual boundaries. What I need to do is to make my patterns that I've done a layout of fit these boundaries. I'm going to start with the second row, and I'm going to bring it up, and I'm going to try and move it so that those blocks fit into that boundary as best I can. I am going to want to fine-tune this. And to do that, I'm going to zoom in to my first block, and I'm going to go into F11, which is the blue handles, and I've got my starts and stops. I'm going to bring the blue square down so that it is right on the corner of that boundary. I then select the next pattern. I'm going to hit the E on my keyboard so that I have an end snap. I need to adjust the other end of this pattern, so I'm going to take the E off. E off, adjust, E on, snap. I'm going to move through all of the patterns on this row, putting my end snap off to adjust, on to snap, off to adjust, on to snap. And I'm going to do that till I get to the end of this row, off to adjust. Now this particular pattern, if I move that end, it's going to make it larger. So I'm going to go into F9. I'm going to move it over close this way, then snap it. Now because this is a quilt and the patterns are all over the place, I need to adjust the top portion. For that, I'm going to go back and adjust each quilt, this time looking at the top of the row. I'm going to go into F12, and that gives me the ability to adjust this pattern without changing where the connecting from one pattern to another. The end snap will remain. I'm going to use the gray square. This does get a little touchy sometimes, so you want small movements. Taking your finger off the mouse is like putting a brake on. And I'm going to adjust this pattern to fit in those boundaries at the top. This is getting pretty good through here. My last pattern, if it's way off, it's snapped down here, I can still change it, whoa, over here. And I think I want to bring that one down just a little bit. Let's see the world here. So those are my patterns, and they're going to fit in that area. I'm going to select my inside boundary. It's blue. In order for a boundary to be selected, it needs to be red. I can hit the L or the K key on my keyboard to change my pattern selection. I'm now going, it's red, I can delete it. Then I can go in, I really don't need to sew this pattern off here, and do an inside fill. Statler's going to make me a new pattern that is going to quilt continuously within that boundary. I also want this one to stitch, but this is my first row. I'm going to move this up and try and get it as close as I can. You will notice that if I start to change these patterns, going to F11, my start and end snaps are off of my quilt. So I'm going to do a fill here, and I really don't need those start and ends. I'm just mostly concerned going to F12, gray handles. I want to pull this pattern down so that it meets with the one below it. I don't need to do the ends of this top pattern because they are off the quilt. They will not show. So I'm adjusting my grays. Now on this quilt, it is a blue border. You're really not going to see much about this, but the back is all white, and I want this to look good from the front and the back. So it's important to adjust all my patterns. Oh, that one's way off. Because it was way off, I want to go up here to this top and pull that top over as well. I can move this over. Move this back. Okay, let's see the world. Now I'm going to take this row of patterns, I'm going to right click and do an inside fill. With that done, I can go ahead and hit sew. One word of caution when you're attempting this style of quilting, make sure that you have your quilt firmly stabilized. I never float when I do a quilt like this because I don't want shrinkage to be an issue. I also stitch down my sides with 4 to 6 stitches per inch. Let's go ahead and quilt this out.
Once again, Paige, I am so impressed with what you have been doing. And I love this new semi-custom because I think that's kind of in between the custom and the edge to edge. And thank you. Thank
You're
you
so
so much for
welcome.
being here.
Yep, this is one of my favorite things to do. I make more money, and the quilt looks custom for my customer.
Well, it's terrific. Will you come back again?
Oh, yes.
All right, all right. Thank you so much for joining us. See you next time.